There is something strangely humbling about picking up a piece of medieval wood in a museum, still solid after 6 or 7 centuries. You hold it, expecting it to crumble, because that is what modern wood does. But it doesn't. It stays firm, dense, almost smug about the fact that it outlived every house on your street. People love to talk about medieval life being dirty and crude. Yet the more archaeologists dig through old shipwrecks, timber frames, barns, monasteries, and even abandoned fishing huts, the more they run into a quiet, recurring mystery. Many medieval structures were astonishingly waterproof, not just resistant to rain or dampness, in some cases nearly immune to rot. That doesn't make sense. In an age without chemicals, power tools, or industrial preservatives, these people managed to build wooden structures and household objects that resisted decay better than most modern building materials. The typical plank from a 25-year-old deck today looks exhausted, split, and gray. Meanwhile, planks hidden in medieval bogs or tucked into the walls of old workshops come out looking like they retired early. This video is about the methods behind those results, methods that modern builders and scientists keep examining because something about them still works better than our improved counterparts. Not for everything, but for a surprising number of things that actually matter. These techniques weren't accidents. They were a system, a way of thinking about water, wood, soil, air, and time. They treat waterproofing not as a coating, but as a relationship between material and environment. And that idea, oddly enough, is what trips us up today. 1. Why medieval wood survived. While ours collapses. Before diving into the methods, it helps to understand the mindset. A medieval carpenter did not think of waterproofing as add something sticky to wood and hope for the best. That is modern thinking. We want a product in a can, something you paint on once every 2 years while swearing at the weather forecast. Medieval waterproofing begins before the wood is even cut. They chose trees in winter when the sap was low. They cut high above the ground where moisture didn't pool. They selected slow-grown timber from dense forests because tight tree rings create natural resistance. A modern lumber yard rarely bothers with any of this. We take fast-grown, plantation-raised wood and then feel surprised when it absorbs water like a sponge. To medieval builders, waterproofing started with biology. They believed wood had a personality, a grain, a direction it preferred, and a way it wanted to sit. A well-placed board survived. A badly placed one rotted. This principle formed the foundation for everything else. 2. The ancient rule of sapwood and heartwood. Heartwood is naturally more resistant to moisture and decay. Medieval builders knew this without chemistry textbooks. They could tell by tapping the log and by the color of the inner ring. Sapwood was the outer pale layer of a tree. That part soaked up water and rotted quickly. So medieval carpenters often peeled the sapwood off deliberately. If they were building something important, they avoided it entirely. Only heartwood was used for beams, posts, ships, and exposed structures. Modern lumber rarely distinguishes between the two in everyday building. We buy whatever is cheapest and hope that coatings compensate. Medieval builders didn't waterproof heartwood as much as they enhanced what it already wanted to do. They respected the material instead of fighting it. The result was a foundation of wood that resisted water before any treatment was even applied. 3. The slow-dry seasoning that modern production. Can't imitate one reason medieval waterproofing seems impossible to replicate is time. They seasoned wood for years, not weeks, not months, years. Logs sat under open-air sheds, protected from direct rain, but exposed to wind. They dried slowly, evenly, and naturally. Modern kiln drying is faster, but more damaging. It forces water out too quickly, opens hairline cracks, and stresses the grain. Those tiny cracks are the first places water creeps in. Medieval timber, dried on its own schedule, held together better. It aged inward instead of ripping outward. That difference alone can create timber that survives centuries. And that is before we even talk about coatings. 4. The 3-ingredient waterproofing mixture that refuses to die. One of the strangest medieval waterproofing methods uses a mixture that seems wrong to modern chemistry: tar, resin, and raw animal fat. It sounds like a prank. But when heated, blended, and brushed onto wood, this mixture created a film that was water-resistant, flexible, and self-healing. The fat kept it supple. The resin made it adhere. The tar sealed pores and prevented biological decay. Over time, the mixture soaked deeper into the grain, especially if the wood was warm. The coating did not form a brittle shell. It merged with the wood. If a crack formed, the mixture slowly migrated into it. Modern coatings often chip or peel because they sit on top rather than bonding. Once moisture gets under them, they fail spectacularly. Medieval waterproofing, ironically, improves with age. 5. The genius of boiled linseed oil in the medieval world. Before linseed oil turned into a hardware store commodity, medieval people used it like a sacred material. They boiled it, sometimes with herbs or minerals, to create a kind of hybrid oil varnish that penetrated wood and hardened inside it. It didn't form an exterior layer. It became part of the material. When scientific tests compare medieval linseed-treated beams with modern oil treatments, something strange shows up. The medieval oil polymerizes more thoroughly. It blocks water better and stiffens the fibers stronger. Why is that? Partly because of the way they boiled it. Medieval cauldrons heated oil unevenly. The impurities, oddly enough, improved the reaction. Modern purified versions sometimes lack the compounds that gave medieval oil its magic. This one is a case where improvement accidentally removed the feature that mattered. 6. The oak tannin trick. That modern science accidentally rediscovers oak was the medieval king of waterproofing, not because it was the only wood available, but because oak is packed with tannins. These tannins react with moisture, minerals, and even iron to form protective compounds that harden the wood. Medieval people didn't know the chemistry, but they knew the outcome. Oak beams pulled from medieval watermills are sometimes so hard they ring like stone. And here is the curious part. Oak in modern construction rarely performs the same way. The difference comes from harvesting. Medieval oak came from ancient forests with slow growth, high tannin concentration, and dense rings. Plantation oak today grows fast and carries fewer tannins. The waterproofing effect is still there, just weaker. The medieval version had the perfect biology. 7. The burned wood technique. That modern builders forgot charring wood on purpose sounds destructive, yet many medieval builders did exactly that. They lightly burned exposed beams, then brushed and oiled the surface. This created a hardened outer shell that resisted insects and water. Japan has a famous equivalent, but Europe used it too, especially in coastal regions. A lightly charred beam repels water far better than untreated wood. It also resists rot because fungi cannot digest carbonized surfaces easily. Modern waterproofing has rediscovered this by accident. People think it is a trendy architectural technique, but medieval workers did it because it worked and because it cost nothing. Fire was cheap. Knowledge was precious. 8. Clay and lime seals. That still beat modern concrete. In some conditions, some medieval builders sealed wood with clay or lime washes. To modern eyes, this looks ridiculous. Clay is not waterproof. Lime is not waterproof. Yet when applied correctly, both can create water-resistant barriers that move, expand, and breathe. Thick lime wash repels water through alkalinity and carbonation. Clay slip fills pores and blocks capillary action. When layered between boards or used to pack joints, these materials keep water where it belongs. One of the reasons medieval houses stayed dry is that the walls could breathe. Instead of trapping moisture, they guided it in predictable ways. Modern waterproofing often makes the mistake of sealing too tightly. Moisture gets trapped. Mold grows in the dark. Medieval walls didn't trap water. They redirected it. 9. The forgotten art of drip edges and runoff control. Sometimes the best waterproofing is not a substance, it is a shape. Medieval builders designed their structures to move water away rather than wage war against it. Roofs were steep. Eaves were long. Timber beams were cut with noses and drip points so water couldn't crawl back toward the building. Every surface had a gesture, a direction it meant water to travel. Modern houses sometimes skip these details because they take time and cost money. We rely on sealants instead. But sealants fail. Gravity doesn't. Medieval builders used gravity as their waterproofing partner. 10. Why medieval roofs stayed watertight. Without chemicals, medieval roofs look simple, but the layering is everything. Thatch, shingles, tiles, and wooden shakes created overlapping systems that channeled water downward. The materials weren't waterproof. The design was. Thatch, for example, sheds water like fur. The water runs down the outer strands and drips off. Beneath that layer is air. Beneath that, another layer. The system always gives water a path that avoids the home. Modern roofs rely on membranes and adhesives. When those fail, everything fails at once. Medieval roofs don't fail catastrophically. They degrade slowly, gracefully, and predictably. This slow degradation is part of the reason medieval roofing lasted so long. You could fix or replace sections without dismantling the entire structure. Maintenance was built into the design. 11. Waterproofing. Through movement instead of resistance. One of the most profound medieval ideas is this. Waterproofing doesn't come from resisting water. It comes from working with it. A plank that swells and shrinks without warping is more waterproof than a plank coated in rigid plastic. A roof that channels water away is more reliable than one covered in a complicated membrane. A beam made of dense, seasoned hardwood resists water better than one soaked in chemical preservatives. The medieval approach wasn't high-tech. It was high wisdom. They allowed the environment to behave as it wanted, and they shaped their materials so that nature's movements didn't harm the structure. Modern waterproofing sometimes tries to freeze materials in place. That works for a while, until the first real winter or the first heavy storm. Medieval waterproofing expected stress, movement, swelling, shrinking, and storms. It made peace with them. And that is why it lasted. 12. The deep secret. Waterproofing begins with the forest. Medieval waterproofing didn't begin in the workshop. It began in the forest. The carpenter who selected the tree had as much influence on the waterproofing outcome as the craftsman who applied the coating. They looked for signs of straight growth, tight rings, age, branch scars, and soil conditions. Trees grown in windy areas produced spiral grain that resisted splitting. Trees grown on slopes had denser lower sections. Oaks from coastal forests had higher mineral content. Every choice mattered. In modern industry, wood is standardized. Everything arrives pre-cut, pre-sorted, and optimized for shipping, not longevity. When we use that wood in outdoor structures, we fight nature instead of working with it. Medieval people trusted nature to do half the work for them. Their job was to guide it, shape it, and assist in its strengths. 13. Why medieval waterproofing works better in the long term. Let's compare two philosophies. Modern waterproofing: seal everything, keep moisture out, coat the surface, fix failures after they appear. Medieval waterproofing: allow movement, guide moisture, build for airflow, protect the material from the inside out. The difference comes down to strategy. One tries to create an impenetrable barrier. The other builds resilience. When water inevitably gets through, the medieval structure is prepared. The modern one is not. This is why old wooden bridges, barns, and boats sometimes last centuries without collapsing. They aren't flawless. They are flexible. They cooperate with water instead of pretending water doesn't exist. 14. The legacy of medieval shipbuilding. Medieval ships are some of the best preserved wooden structures anywhere. Saltwater should destroy wood, yet many shipwrecks show astonishing preservation. Partly, this is because of deep water oxygen levels, but much of it comes from the techniques used. Shipbuilders used oak with high tannin content, plank seams packed with tar, moss, hair, or wool, linseed oil coatings, layered planking that moved with the waves. The interesting part is that glue was not heavily used. Ships relied on joints, nails, and natural swelling of planks to form watertight seals. When water hit untreated wood, the wood expanded and tightened the seams. The sea helped seal the ship. A modern vessel would never tolerate that. It sounds like witchcraft, but it was simply an understanding of wood's natural behavior. 15. The role of microorganisms in medieval waterproofing. This part rarely gets discussed, but it matters. Some medieval coatings actively encouraged beneficial microorganisms. Tar and resin, for example, create surfaces that certain bacteria colonize. These bacteria form biofilms that repel moisture and protect wood. Modern coatings kill everything. They try to sterilize the surface. This can backfire because some fungi thrive in environments where beneficial organisms are absent. Medieval coatings fostered a microecosystem that supported the wood rather than attacking it. Nature did more waterproofing than we realized. 16. What we lost. When we stopped listening to wood. The truth is that medieval waterproofing works so well because it is the opposite of industrial thinking. It is slow. It is observational. It accepts that materials behave differently depending on where they came from. It understands that water is not an enemy, but an element to be respected. This is why modern reconstructions of medieval techniques often struggle. People try to rush the process or substitute materials. They use fast-grown timber, apply linseed oil without proper boiling, skip the slow seasoning, or ignore the role of environment. Medieval waterproofing was not one trick. It was a symphony of behaviors that reinforced each other. 17. Why scientists still study. Medieval waterproofing. You can walk into a preservation lab today and find researchers analyzing medieval coatings, not because they want to recreate them for ancient architecture, although sometimes they do. They study them because these mixtures outperform modern materials in low-tech, long-term, natural settings. For outdoor structures that must survive decades without maintenance, medieval methods are often superior. They require no power, no complex supply chain, and no synthetic chemicals. They rely entirely on natural interactions. This fascinates researchers today because we are entering an era where sustainability matters. Medieval waterproofing is sustainable by definition, and that gives it a future. 18. Lessons we can still use. Today, the best way to appreciate medieval waterproofing is not to romanticize it, but to see how practical it is. Use heartwood over sapwood. Season wood slowly and naturally. Allow structures to breathe instead of trapping moisture. Use coatings that penetrate instead of forming brittle shells. Choose materials based on how they behave, not how cheap they are. Design shapes that send water away rather than trying to block it. These principles work in any era, with any tools. When you follow them, the wood thanks you by lasting far longer than expected. The medieval world wasn't magical. Its people were not wizards hiding secret formulas in dusty manuscripts. Their genius came from paying attention to the world around them. They learned how water behaved. They learned how trees responded. They watched materials for decades, even generations, and passed down what worked instead of what sold. Their waterproofing methods endure because they were built on truth. Not synthetic shortcuts, not single application solutions. They understood that waterproofing is not just about protection. It is about understanding relationships between material, climate, and time. That is why medieval wood still survives in barns and churches and shipwrecks, while modern wood sighs and gives up after a handful of rainy seasons. The old builders weren't trying to fight nature. They were collaborating with it.